Hey friends, it's Robin. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are starting a new series that I am going to be doing over the next couple of months. So one of my favorite videos that I did last year was my KU 3-part vlog series where I went through everything on my Kindle TBR. I did a vlog style try a chapter, and then I vlogged reading a couple of those books. And I just really loved that whole series. And I've been trying to come up with a way to kind of recreate that, but in a totally new way. So, with it being February and a lot of people reading fantasy romance, I really wanted to find a way to incorporate that into my posting schedule. I decided to mash all of these ideas together and I came up with this like multi-step vlog type of series that we're going to be doing over the next 2 months or so. It's going to have 5 parts in total, 4 of them coming this month, and the final one coming next month. The idea of this is going to be going through a bunch of fantasy subgenres, and in each of these subgenres, kind of going over what they are, what they contain. I'm going to give you some recommendations for each of the categories, and then we're going to do another vlog style try a chapter with a couple of books that are on my TBR that fall into those categories. And then once I have done all of that, I'm going to pick one book from each of these 4 videos that I'm going to do. And in March, we're going to do one vlog where I read those 4 books. Unfortunately, February is super packed, so the final vlog is not going to be able to happen in the month of February. So it's going to happen in March, but we're going to make do. Over the month of February, every single Monday, I am going to post one of these videos, and they are going to cover 4 different categories of fantasy romance. These are not by any means the only subcategories. These were just the 4 categories that I came up with that encompassed all of the books that I wanted to talk about, including the recommendations as well as the ones on my TBR. So this is not a comprehensive list of every subgenre. These aren't necessarily the only ones, the best ones, anything like that. Starting today, we're going to be talking about low fantasy. Inside low fantasy, particularly urban and paranormal romances. Next Monday, we will be talking about angels and demons, then monsters, and finally high or epic fantasy. Like I said, these are not all of the subgenres. There are millions of subgenres that you could come up with under the umbrella of fantasy. But these were the ones that I decided to go with. I have created graphics for all of these categories over on Instagram. So every day that I'm posting one of these videos, there is going to be a corresponding Instagram post with a bunch of graphics and definitions and things like that so that you can go save that, read it, peruse it at your disposal. And along with the recommendations that I give in this video, those posts will have additional recommendations. So if you aren't following me over on Instagram, my Instagram is always linked down below. Like I said, starting today with low fantasy. Low fantasy is such a large umbrella and so many things fall into low fantasy. So low fantasy at its core is essentially anything that takes place in our world but contains slightly magical or unrealistic elements. This can be anything from witches, it can be magical nature, it can be vampires, it can be magical realism, it can be pretty much anything that isn't already based in reality. It is just taking those slightly unrealistic elements, plopping them into the everyday world, and you have low fantasy. Low fantasy tends to get a bad name because we compare it to high fantasy, which is harder and more difficult, and low fantasy I feel like sometimes gets a negative connotation. But it's not that it's easier. It's not light fantasy or anything like that. It's just that the magic system itself is low. Once you get into low fantasy, there is a ridiculous number of subgenres. You have shifter romances, you have vampire romances, you have urban fantasy, magical realism. There are so many different subgenres that you could come up with that fit into this umbrella. But since I'm a romance reader, the 2 main subgenres that I'm going to be talking about here are urban fantasy and paranormal romance. There is quite a bit of overlap between the 2 of these. The main difference being, one, urban fantasy must be set in an urban setting. So you could have something that is a low fantasy romance that is not urban fantasy romance. The best example that I can give for urban fantasy is pretty much anything written by Nalini Singh, especially her Guild Hunter series. That series takes place in New York City in a world that looks just like ours, except it contains angels and vampires. So it is a world that is ours, but has magical elements in a massive city. Something that is historical or small town based is not going to fall into the urban fantasy romance category. It is going to fall into the low fantasy romance category. So something like the Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels is romance heavy, but it is not going to fall into urban romance. It's set in Victoria, London. So that's going to fall into your low fantasy. Again, urban fantasy and paranormal romance have a ton of overlap, but the main difference is that paranormal romance must be romance centric. You can have urban fantasy that is not romance based. For example, Neil Gaiman's books are often classified as urban fantasy, but they're not going to be paranormal romance because they're not romance based. Paranormal romance, this is going to be anything that's vampires, shifters, ghosts, psychics, witches, anything like that is falling under paranormal romance. So I hope that makes sense. And again, just like with the low fantasy versus urban fantasy, paranormal romance does not need to take place in that urban setting. I'm gonna pop up a little graphic that I made right here that I threw onto that Instagram post that just kind of visualizes how all of these overlap. So hopefully this helps a little bit. And from here, we're gonna go into some recommendations. First up on my recommendations is one that I've already talked about, and that is the Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels. There are 2 books that are already released, and the 3rd book actually comes out super soon. I want to say that it's this coming spring. In this book, we are following these pirates and witches, and all of these women have discovered this magical spell that allows them to fly anything. Pirates fly houses, and the witches fly themselves. So they will cast the spell on themselves and they can fly, and they have very different views on how to use the spell. Pirates love to be showy about it, and the witches like to fly under the radar, and because of this, they have a massive rivalry. So this series is all about them trying to best each other. The pirates fight amongst themselves, whereas the witches tend to work more together, and it is funny and witty and quirky, and I can't get enough. It is just such a good time. These have amazing enemies to lovers romances. They have hilarious banter and just really strong female heroines, especially since they are set in the Victorian era. So all of these women are really sassy and really strong, and I love this series a lot. After that, we have the Fortuna Sworn series by KJ Sutton. This has so many different fantastical elements in it. You have shifters, you have fae, you have dragons, you have pretty much any sort of paranormal being you can think of ends up coming into play at some point. I am completely obsessed with it. I think the way that Kelsey has plotted this book and built the romances and explored a lot of different like familial relationships is just so well done. But the penultimate book is coming hopefully later this year. If you haven't heard of this series, book 1 opens up with our heroine Fortuna, who is desperately searching for her brother who had disappeared a couple of years ago, and she ends up learning that he has been taken to the Fae, and a Fae is willing to help her save her brother as long as she is willing to marry him. And things kind of go from there. The plot changes drastically from that point, but there is an amazing love triangle in here, and it is a true love triangle, and it's fantastic. After that, we have Go Hex Yourself by Jessica Clare, and this is a witchy rom-com that it doesn't get enough hype. This is following our heroine, who is a human, and she is looking for a new job, and she responds to an ad in a newspaper for a job as a familiar, and she thinks that she is applying to her favorite card game. Turns out that she is now a familiar to an actual witch, and she doesn't believe that magic is real. So the witch and her nephew plot to convince our heroine that magic is actually real, and it is her learning about magic and falling in love with a very, very grumpy warlock who lives in the same house as her now. It is really cute and funny, and I love how our heroine reacts to magic because she is very, very tentative about whether or not it is real, even when it is like right in her face. I love I loved the meddling grandmothers in here. It is just such a fun, good time. There is a sentient cat as well, so definitely one I recommend if you are looking for a good witchy rom-com. Then we have some classic. You done? Then we have some classic urban fantasy, which is the Guild Hunter series by Nalini Singh. We are following our heroine who is a guild hunter. They are humans. Can you stop? They are humans with slightly above average abilities. Our heroine can scent, and so she is a very good hunter because she can smell vampires. And right at the beginning of the book, she ends up having to work with an archangel in order to track down another archangel. It kind of goes from there, and it ends up being a fated mates story between our guild hunter and an archangel. In this world, there are archangels and angels and vampires. If you are looking for a really fantastic urban fantasy, there's nothing better than Nalini Singh. Another urban fantasy that is more urban fantasy than urban fantasy romance, but it's still one I wanted to recommend just because this series does not get enough love, and that is Dark and Hollow Star by Ashley Shuttleworth. This is a new adult fae fantasy romance series that is very, very urban fantasy. This is set in Vancouver, and we are following a whole collection of different people. We are following a Fury, a half fae, and a fae prince as they are trying to solve a mystery, and that mystery ends up bringing them all together to possibly take down some corrupt people. There is a lot of politics. There is a lot of fantasy elements in here, but all of those fantasy elements are set in our real world. This is a long book. However, the cast is so fantastic. There are romances in here, but they are a little bit slower burn, and this is a more older YA new adult-esque, so the steaminess is quite low, but the romances are still fantastic. It is just a really, really fantastic fantasy. It's also extremely queer, and it just doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves. Then we have Mating the Huntress by Talia Hibbert, which I think I recommend all the time, but it's one of my favorite shifter romances. It is a really short novella that is following our heroine, who is a werewolf hunter, and she is determined to prove herself to her family, who are all hunters. In order to do that, she decides that she is going to take down this werewolf that keeps coming into her coffee shop. The werewolf is pretty sure that she is his mate, and so he keeps asking her out on dates, and finally she accepts as a ruse to take him out, and the two of them end up having a romance. It is absolutely hilarious. Our hero is very wolfish. He doesn't always understand accepted human behaviors, and so our heroine keeps trying to kill him, and he thinks that it is an act of romance. And so it is just a really fun, good time. I highly recommend giving this one a read. In a very different vein, we have Parallel by Elizabeth O'Rourke, which is a duet that is all about time travel. And in this one, we are following our heroine. It opens up with her going to a wedding venue, and she sees a house across the lake, and she suddenly has visions, and she knows things about the lake and about the house and about the people that live there, and she doesn't know why, and then she faints. And when she wakes up, the doctor that is taking care of her is one of the guys that she sees in her visions and dreams, and it is her trying to figure out, how does she know all these things? How are she and him connected? And it is so wild and so twisty, and it is a fantastic read. This is definitely one of my favorite time travel romances I've ever read. Make sure you have book 2 ready, because book 1 does end on a cliffhanger, but you do get your happily ever after in book 2. After that, we have The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston, which is a traditionally published paranormal romance, all surrounding our heroine who can see ghosts. Her family runs a funeral parlor, and her father have always been able to see ghosts. And when her father passes away, she has to return to her small town, and unfortunately at the same time, she is having a writer's block, but her publishers are really pushing her to write her next book. And when she gets down to her small town for her father's funeral, she sees her editor as a ghost. And it is the two of them trying to figure out why she can see him, how he became a ghost, what happened to him, and how to send him on. And all the while, they are falling in love, and it is so well done. I've talked about this a lot, but I think Ashley Poston is just doing some really fun things in the paranormal romance genre. And her next book is about a time slip. So the two main characters are falling in love 7 years apart. And I just think that she's doing some really fun and different things. The next paranormal romance is Sanctuary by Alexandria House. And this is such a unique take on paranormal romance because it doesn't follow any of your more traditional paranormal romance creatures. This is actually following an immortal. This is a really awesome fated mates romance as well. It is also a second chance romance. Our heroine is reconnecting with a guy from her past, and it turns out that he had some secrets, and it is the two of them falling in love and getting their second chance at love. Like I said, I thought this was such a unique take on paranormal since it doesn't follow your more traditional paranormal beings. Then we have The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Singu Mandana. This falls far more into our low fantasy category since this is a small town cozy fantasy. And while there is a romance in here, this is far more contemporary than it is romance based. We are following our heroine who is a witch, but in this world, witches need to keep their powers secret and they spend a lot of time alone because when multiple witches get together, magic can kind of accumulate in that spot and cause weird things to happen. And so our heroine is very lonely and very alone, and she suddenly receives this request to come to this small town and help these three really young witches try and control their magic. And so she goes to this small town and moves in with this quirky cast of characters, and they are their own little found family, and it is so cute and so adorable. And I loved all of the explorations of family and love in here. While this isn't strongly romance, this really does explore love in all of its different forms, whether it's platonic or familial or romantic. It is just a beautiful, cozy story. Okay, so that is it for the recommendations portion of this. Again, I will have all of these books linked down below if you want to go give them a read, check out the full synopses, all of those things. So from here, I'm going to go into some of the books that are on my TBR that fit into this, and we can talk about which ones I am going to give a try. All right, we have relocated. My husband actually took over the downstairs, so now we are in my newly reorganized office, so this is going to look a little bit different. I have 4 books for this category that I am going to try out. So first up is Not Your Ex's Hexes by April Asher, which is actually book 2 in a series, but the series is made up of standalones, so you can read this without it like ruining book 1. This is following our heroine, who is the sister of the heroine in book 1. She was always primed to take over this very powerful position, but she ends up no longer being in that position, and now she is trying to figure out what to do next with her life. And in this book, she ends up having a one-night stand with a half-demon, and they kind of have a one-night stand turned friends with benefits turned lovers. The one caveat being that our half-demon is cursed, and if he falls in love, he will lose his humanity. This sounds like such a fun take on a witchy romance. I really enjoyed the plus size rep in book 1. I really liked the rom-com style of that book, and I'm very excited to get another book in the series, so we're going to read the first chapter of this one. The other traditionally published book that I have is The Minuscule Mansion of Myra Malone by Audrey Burgess, and this one is slightly less romantic and more on the low fantasy side, but there is a romance in here as far as I can tell. We are following this woman who blogs about her like making of these dollhouse mansions, and she kind of blows up, and on the other side of the country, this guy ends up seeing a picture of one of the dollhouses that she makes, and it is identical down to the very last detail of his like house. These two don't know each other and they don't know how she is able to see what his house looks like. So it sounds like there is some sort of paranormal element in here, and I believe they come together and have a romance. The last two are indie books. So we have Haunted by Christina C. Jones. This is a vampire romance. So in this one, we're following our heroine who is like a normal human. She lives a pretty standard and normal life, but she ends up like her and her sister end up noticing that some weird stuff keeps happening around them, and her sister is convinced that something paranormal is going on. And at the same time, this guy enters into our heroine's life and she starts questioning what is real. She needs to figure out what is going on in this situation. I believe this is a trilogy, so I'm really excited to give this one a read. I've read one Christina C. Jones book before and I loved it, and I've heard nothing but good things about her other books, so I'm excited to give this one a try. And then lastly, we have a book that I just randomly added on my KU, and that is Frost by C.N. Crawford. Like I said, I just found this randomly while I was scrolling on Kindle Unlimited, and I had never heard of it, but the synopsis sounded really, really interesting. This gives me a lot of the same vibes as the Fortuna Sport series, which is why I ended up adding it. But the synopsis says that on my worst birthday, I found my boyfriend in bed with another woman. Within hours, I'm drunk, homeless, and pledging to stay single forever until a dangerous, sexy Seelie King rolls through town. Every generation, they hold a competition for the Seelie Queen, but for reasons that the Seelie King won't explain, he just wants to do this for show and not a real marriage, and he convinces her to participate. She is wrapped up in all of the Seelie politics. Like I said, this gives me a lot of the same vibes as Fortuna Sword. Those are the 4 books that we are going to give a try, and we're going to go through and we're going to read the first chapter of each of them. Just like I did in the other one, if there is a really short prologue, I will read the prologue as well as chapter 1. So let's get right to it. I think I'm going to start with the one physical book since it's right here. So I think I'm going to start with The Minuscule Mansion of Myra Malone. Sorry if the camera is shaking. The kitten's going wild. But I'm going to start with this one, and then I'll come back once I have finished the first chapter. Okay, so I just finished the first chapter of this, and it was really cool. The way that the first chapter is written is it's kind of like a little blog post by our heroine, and she's talking about the minuscule mansion, and it opens up with that blog post of her just kind of asking you to picture your dream house. What would a house look like? If your imagine could run wild, what would that house look like? And she talks about how this blog is going to be her doing that, but she's going to actually make it. And she talks about how she learned how to do all of this from her grandparents. And it sounds really cool. I really enjoyed the way that it was written. It feels very cozy, but the first chapter was only 3 pages long. So from there, I think I'm just going to go into the other trade one and get the 2 trade books out of the way. So we're going to pick up Not Your Ex's Hexes by April Asher, and I will be back once I have finished the first chapter. I just finished the first chapter of Not Your Ex's Hexes by April Asher, and this first chapter was fine. The first chapter is the rescuing of, or the failed rescue of 2 horses. It didn't give me much. Essentially, our 3 main characters, they're triplets, the sisters are triplets. Our heroine in this book is trying to figure out what to do with her life now that she is no longer in that leadership position, and she comes across these 2 horses that she wants to save in the middle of the night, and then the cops show up and arrest the 3 sisters. That was the first chapter. It wasn't bad or anything, it didn't do much for me. So that is the last of the trade books. I think next I'm going to go for Haunted by Christina C. Jones, just because I'm so excited about this one. I'm going to get into this one. Oh, there it is. And I will come back to you in just a minute. So So I just finished, well, not finished. I just finished the first chapter of Haunted by Christina C. Jones, and I'm obsessed with this. This opens up with our heroine who has this like on again, off again boyfriend, and they work in kind of like coexisting businesses. So he runs a hotel and she runs the like bar club in the hotel. It's called Onyx and Ivory, which I think is super clever. But it opens up with them like in bed and she feels some sort of presence. And so she flips on the lights and nobody is there. Her boyfriend just kind of like goes back to bed and she gets up and she's like looking out the window because she still feels like she's being watched and she sees two eyes in the window, like in the reflection, but nobody is there and then they're gone. And she starts having these like hallucinations or visions of somebody with like dark black eyes and suddenly she is like over her boyfriend and like everything that he does is irritating her and she can't figure out why. And I'm assuming this is like a fated mates sort of thing because she talks about like how she's never felt connected to a boyfriend before. So I'm assuming this is like a fated mates paranormal thing to where like she can't love because her mate exists. I really, really liked this first chapter a lot. I have one more book to read. So the last one that I am going to read is Frost by Sam Crawford. And then once I'm done with that, we'll come back and I'm gonna rank them and then we will figure out what the first book on my vlog TBR is. So I just finished the last one, which was Frost by Cian Crawford, and I read the prologue and the first chapter, and I also love this. This opens up with our heroine who is a fae, and the little prologue is talking about how her and this human, Andrew, fell in love and how she thought their romance was perfect and he made her feel safe and secure and loved and cared for when she never really had that. And chapter one is her coming home on her birthday and finding that boyfriend in bed with another woman. And it is really well written because the heroine is like yelling at him and he's like, but I fell in love. Like, why are you being so selfish? You should be happy for me. She's just like, fuck you, dude. Like, no, you are in bed with another woman. She was paying for everything because she's the one that has a job and he is going to school. And so their like agreement for their life was always that he was going to go to school because he's going to school for finance. And then once he has a full-time job, she would open up her dream business. Turns out that he was only staying with her because she was paying all of his bills. So now she's leaving him high and dry, but she has nowhere else to go because she lived with him. I really liked the humor that was instilled into that first chapter because it could have been like a very heart-wrenching and like difficult to read chapter, and it had a more humorous tone to it while still feeling dramatic. You know what I mean? So it was a good balance. Those are the first four books, and let's rank them really quick. So I think in my number four spot is going to be Not Your Ex's Hexes by April Asher, just because that first chapter didn't really give me anything. Like I said, it was just horse rescue. I thought it was fine. In the number three spot, I am going to put The Minuscule Mansion of My Room Alone, just because that first chapter was so short, maybe 2 pages. But I did enjoy it. I liked the writing. I liked the concept. I think in the number two spot, I'm going to put Frost by Cian Crawford. I really thought that this was fun and funny, and I do super duper want to read this one. But Haunted by Christina C. Jones is going to go in the number one spot because of the four, that is the one that I want to continue like right now. I really want to just go back and read that one, and I think it'll be fun to vlog that one because it is short. It's less than 200 pages, so I think that would be a perfect one for the vlog. And like I said, that's the one that I'm like itching to continue immediately. So we have our first book for the vlog, and then in next week's video, we are going to be covering Angels and Demons and kind of talking about where that fits into the whole fantasy romance bubble and going over some recommendations and trying a couple more books. And let me know what you think of this video concept. Let me know if there are any other books for this category that should be either recommended or I should add to my list. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you all in my next video. Bye!